Chapter 9 of The Sport of the Gods. Recording by Rick Cornwall. The Sport of the Gods by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Chapter 9. His Heart's Desire. Whatever else his visit to the theatre may have done for Joe, it inspired him with a desire to go to work and earn money of his own, to be independent both of parental help and control, and so be able to spend as he pleased. With this end in view he set out to hunt for work. It was a pleasant contrast to his last similar quests, and he felt it with joy. He was treated everywhere he went with courtesy, even when no situation was forthcoming. Finally he came upon a man who was willing to try him for an afternoon. From the moment, the boy rightly considered himself engaged, for he was master of his trade. He began his work with heart elate. Now he had within his grasp the possibility of being all that he wanted to be. Now Thomas might take him out at any time and not be ashamed of him. With Thomas, the fact that Joe was working put the boy in an entirely new light. He decided that now he might be worth cultivating. For a week or two he had ignored him, and proceeded upon the principle that if you give corn to the old hen, she will cluck to her chicks. Had treated Mrs. Hamilton with marked deference and kindness. This had been without success, as both the girl and her mother held themselves politely aloof from him. He began to see that his hope of winning Kitty's affections lay, not in courting the older woman, but in making a friend of the boy. So, on a certain Saturday night, when the Banner Club was to give one of its smokers, he asked Joe to go with him. Joe was glad to, and they set out together. Arrived, Thomas left his companion for a few moments while he attended, as he said, to a little business. What he really did was to seek out the proprietor of the club and some of its hangers-on. "I say," he said, "I've got a friend with me tonight. He's got some dough on him. He's fresh and young and easy." "Whew!" explained the proprietor. "Yes, he's a good thing, but push it along kin of light at first. He might get skittish." "Thomas, let me fall on your bosom and weep," said a young man who, on account of his usual expression of innocent gloom, was called Sadness. "This is what I've been looking for a month. My hat was getting decidedly shabby. Do you think he would stand for a touch on the first night of our acquaintance?" "Don't you dare. Do you want to frighten him off? Make him believe that you've got coin to burn, and that it's an honour to be with you." "But, you know, he may expect a glimpse of the gold." "A smart man don't need to show nothing. All he's got to do is act." "Oh, I'll act. We'll all act." "Be slow to take a drink with him." "Thomas, my boy, you're an angel. I recognize that more and more every day. But bid me do anything else but that. That I refuse. It's against nature." And Sadness looked more mournful than ever. "Trust old Sadness to do his part," said the portly proprietor, and Thomas went back to the lamb. "Nothing doing so early," he said. "Let's go and have a drink." They went, and Thomas ordered. "No, no, this is on me," cried Joe, trembling with joy. "Pshaw, your money's counterfeit," said his companion with fine generosity. "This is on me, I say. Jack, what'll you have yourself?" As they stood at the bar, the men began strolling up one by one. Each in his turn was introduced to Joe. They were very polite. They treated him with a pale, dignified, high-minded respect that menaced his pocketbook and possessions. The proprietor, Mr. Turner, asked him why he had never been in before. He really seemed much hurt about it, and on being told that Joe had only been in the city for a couple of weeks, expressed emphatic surprise, even disbelief, and assured the rest that any one would have taken Mr. Hamilton for an old New Yorker. Sadness was introduced last. He bowed to Joe's "Happy to know you, Mr. Williams." "Better known as Sadness," he said, with an expression of deep gloom. "A distant relative of mine once had a great grief. I've never recovered from it." Joe was not quite sure how to take this, but the others laughed, and he joined them, and then, to cover his own embarrassment, he did what he thought the only correct and manly thing to do. He ordered a drink. "I don't know as I ought to," said Sadness. "Oh, come on," his companions called out. "Don't be stiff with a stranger. Make him feel at home." "Mr. Hamilton will believe me when I say I have no intention of being stiff, but duty is duty. I've got to go down to pay a bill, and if I get too much abroad, it wouldn't be safe walking around with money on me." "Aw, shut up, Sadness," said Thomas. "My friend Mr. Hamilton will feel hurt if you don't drink with him." "I certainly will," was Joe's opportune remark, and he was pleased to see that it caused the reluctant one to yield. They took a drink. There was quite a line of them. Joe asked the bartender what he would have. The men warmed towards him. They took several more drinks with him, and he was happy. Sadness put his arm about his shoulder, and told him with tears in his eyes that he looked like a cousin of his that had died. "Aw, shut up, Sadness," said someone else. "Be respectable." Sadness turned his mournful eyes upon the speaker. "I won't," he replied. "Being respectable is very nice as a diversion, but it's tedious if done steadily." Joe did not quite take this, so he ordered another drink. A group of young fellows came in and passed up the stairs. "Shearing another lamb?" said one of them significantly. "Well, with that gang, it will be well done." Thomas and Joe left the crowd after a while and went to the upper floor, where, in a long, brilliantly lighted room, tables were set out for drinking parties. At one end of the room was a piano, and a man sat at it listlessly strumming some popular air. The proprietor joined them pretty soon, and steered them to a table opposite the door. "Just sit down here, Mr. Hamilton," he said, "and you can see everybody that comes in. We have lots of nice people here on smoker nights, especially after the shows are out and the girls come in." Joe's heart gave a great leap, and then settled as cold as lead. Of course those girls wouldn't speak to him, but his hopes rose as the proprietor went on talking to him and to no one else. Mr. Turner always made a man feel as if he were of some consequence in the world, and men a good deal older than Joe had been fooled by his manner. He talked to one in a soft, ingratiating way, giving his whole attention apparently. He tapped one confidently on the shoulder, as who should say, "My dear boy, I have but two friends in the world, and you are both of them." Joe, charmed and pleased, kept his head well. There is a great deal in heredity, and his father had not been Morris Oakley's butler for so many years for nothing. The Banner Club was an institution for the lower education of Negro youth. It drew its pupils from every class of people and from every part of the country. It was composed of all sorts and conditions of men, educated and uneducated, dishonest and less so, of the good, the bad, and the unexposed. Parasites came there to find victims, politicians for votes, reporters for news, and artists of all kinds for colour and inspiration. It was a place of assembly for a number of really bright men who, after days of hard and often unrewarded work, came there and drunk themselves drunk in each other's company, and when they were drunk talked of the eternal verities. The Banner was only one of a kind. It stood to the stranger and to the man and woman without connections for the whole social life. It was a substitute, poor it must be confessed, to many youths for the home life which is so lacking among certain classes in New York. Here the rounders congregated, or came and spent the hours until it was time to go forth to bout or assignation. Here, too, came sometimes the curious who wanted to see something of the other side of life. Among these, white visitors were not infrequent, those who were young enough to be fascinated by the bizarre, and those who were old enough to know that it was all in the game. Mr. Skaggs of the New York Universe was one of the former class, and a constant visitor. He and a lady friend called Maudie, who had a penchant for dancing to ragtime melodies as only the professor of such a club can play them. Of course the place was a social cesspool, generating a poisonous miasma and reeking with the stench of decayed and rotten moralities. There is no defence to be made for it. But what do you expect when false idealism and fevered ambition come face to face with catering cupidity? It was into this atmosphere that Thomas had introduced the boy Joe, and he sat there now by his side, firing his mind by pointing out the different celebrities who came in, and telling highly flavoured stories of their lives or doings. Joe heard things that had never come within the range of his mind before. "Ah, there's Skaggsy and Maudie. Maudie, his girl, you know, and he's a reporter on the New York Universe. Fine fellow, Skaggsy." Maudie, a portly, voluptuous looking brunette, left her escort and went directly to the space by the piano. Here she was soon dancing with one of the coloured girls who had come in. Skaggs started to sit down alone at a table, but Thomas called him. "Come over here, Skaggsy." In the moment that it took the young man to reach them, Joe wondered if he could ever reach that state when he could call that white man Skaggsy and the girl Maudie. The newcomer soon set all of that at ease. "I want you to know my friend Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Skaggs." "How do you do, Hamilton? I'm glad to meet you. Now look a here. Don't you let old Thomas here string you about me being any old Mr. Skaggs. I'm Skaggsy to all of my friends. I hope to count you among 'em." It was such a supreme moment that Joe could not find words to answer, so he called for another drink. "Not a bit of it," said Skaggsy, "not a bit of it. When I meet my friends I always reserve to myself the right of ordering the first drink. Waiter, this is on me. What'll you have, gentlemen?" They got their drinks, and then Skaggsy leaned over confidentially and began talking. "I tell you, Hamilton, there ain't an ounce of prejudice in my body. Do you believe it?" Joe said that he did. Indeed, Skaggsy struck one as being aggressively unprejudiced. He went on: "You see, a lot of fellows say to me, 'What do you want to go downtown to that nigger club for?' That's what they called it, nigger club. But I say to 'em, 'Gentlemen, at that nigger club, as you choose to call it, I get more inspiration than I could at any of the greater clubs in New York. I've often been invited to join some of the swell clubs here, but I never do it. By Jove, I'd rather come down here and fellowship right in with you fellows. I like colored people, anyway. It's natural. You see, my father had a big plantation and owned lots of slaves. No offense, of course, but it was a custom of that time. And I've played with little darkies ever since I could remember." It was the same old story that the white who associates with Negroes from volition usually tells to explain his taste. The truth about the young reporter was that he was born and reared on a Vermont farm, where his early life was passed in fighting for his very subsistence. But this never troubled Skaggsy. He was a monumental liar, and the saving quality about him was that he calmly believed his own lies while he was telling them. So no one was hurt, for the deceiver was as much victim as the deceived. The boys who knew him best used to say that when Skaggs got started on one of his debauches of lying, the recording angel always put on an extra clerical force. "Now look at Maudie," he went on. "Would you believe it? She was of a fine, rich family, and that the colored girl she's dancing with now used to be her servant? She's just like me about that. Absolutely no prejudice." Joe was wide-eyed with wonder and admiration, and he couldn't understand the amused expression on Thomas's face, nor why he surreptitiously kicked him under the table. Finally the reporter went his way, and Joe's sponsor explained to him that he was not to take in what Skaggsy said, and that there ain't been a word of truth in it. He ended with, "Everybody knows Maudie, and that colored girl is Mamie Lacey, and never worked for anybody in her life. Skaggsy's a good fellow, all right, but he's the biggest liar in New York." The boy was distinctly shocked. He wasn't sure but Thomas was jealous of the attention the white man had shown him, and wished to belittle it. Anyway, he did not thank him for destroying his romance. About 11 o'clock, when the people began to drop in from the plays, the master of ceremonies opened proceedings by saying that the free concert would now begin, and he hoped that all present, ladies included, would act like a gentleman and not forget the waiter. Mr. Merriweather will now favor us with the latest coon song, entitled "Come Back to Yo' Baby, Honey." There was a patter of applause, and a young negro came forward, and in a strident music hall voice sung, or rather recited with many gestures, the ditty. He couldn't have been much older than Joe, but already his face was hard with dissipation and foul knowledge. He gave the song with all the rank suggestiveness that could be put into it. Joe looked upon him as a hero. He was followed by a little brown-skinned fellow with an immature Vandyke beard and a lisp. He sung his own composition, and was funny. How much funnier than he himself knew or intended, may not even be hinted at. Then, while an instrumentalist, who seemed to have a grudge against the piano, was hammering out the opening bars of a march, Joe's attention was attracted by a woman entering the room, and from that moment he heard no more of the concert. Even when the master of ceremonies announced with an air that by special request he himself should sing, "Answer," the request was his own. He did not draw the attention of the boy away from the yellow-skinned divinity who sat at the near table, drinking whiskey straight. She was a small girl with fluffy dark hair and good features. A tiny foot peeped out from beneath her rattling silk skirts. She was a good-looking young woman, and daintily made, though her face was no longer youthful, and one might have wished that with her complexion she did not run to silk waist and magenta. Joe, however, saw no fault in her. She was altogether lovely to him, and his delight was the more poignant as he recognized in her one of the girls he had seen on the stage a couple of weeks ago. That being true, nothing could keep her from being glorious in his eyes, not even the grease paint which adhered in unneat patches to her face, nor her taste for whiskey in its unreformed state. He gazed at her in ecstasy until Thomas, turning to see what had attracted him, said with a laugh, "Oh, it's Hattie Sterling. Want to meet her?" Again the young fellow was dumb. Just then Hattie also noticed his intent look, and nodded and beckoned to Thomas. "Come on," he said, rising. "Oh, she didn't ask for me," cried Joe, tremulous and eager. His companion went away laughing. "Who's your young friend?" said Hattie. "A fellow from the South." "Well, bring him over here." Joe could hardly believe in his own good luck, and his head, which was getting a bit weak, was near collapsing when his divinity asked him what he'd have. He began to protest, until she told the waiter with an air of authority to make it a little ski. Then she asked him for a cigarette, and began talking to him in a pleasant, soothing way between puffs. When the drinks came, she said to Thomas, "Now, old man, you've been awfully nice, but when you get your little drink you run away like a good little boy. You're superfluous." Thomas answered, "Well, I like that," but obediently gulped his whisky and withdrew, while she laughed until the master of ceremonies stood up and looked sternly at him. The concert had long been over and the room was less crowded when Thomas sauntered back to the pair. "Well, good night," he said. "Guess you can find your way home, Mr. Hamilton," and he gave Joe a long wink. "Good night," said Joe woozily. "I'll be all right. Good night." "Make it another ski," was Hattie's farewell remark. It was late the next morning when Joe got home. He had a headache and a sense of triumph that not even his illness and his mother's reproof could subdue. He had promised Hattie to come often to the club. Chapter 9. The Sport of the Gods by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Chapter 10. A Visitor from Home. Mrs. Hamilton began to question very seriously whether she had done the best thing in coming to New York, as she saw her son staying away more and more and growing always further away from her and his sister. Had she known how and where he spent his evenings, she would have had even greater cause to question the wisdom of their trip. She knew that although he worked, he never had any money for the house, and she foresaw the time when the little they had would no longer suffice for Kitty and her. Realizing this, she herself set out to find something to do. It was a hard matter, for wherever she went seeking employment, it was always for her and her daughter, for the more she saw of Mrs. Jones, the less she thought it well to leave the girl under her influence. Mrs. Hamilton was not a keen woman, but she had a mother's intuition, and she saw a subtle change in her daughter. At first the girl grew wistful, and then impatient and rebellious. She complained that Joe was away from them so much enjoying himself, while she had to be housed up like a prisoner. She had receded from her dignified position, and twice of an evening she had gone out for a car ride with Thomas. But as that gentleman never included the mother in his invitation, she decided that her daughter should go no more, and she begged Joe to take his sister out sometimes instead. He demurred at first, for he now numbered among his city acquirements a fine contempt for his woman relatives. Finally, however, he consented, and took Kit once to the theatre, and once for a ride. Each time he left her in the care of Thomas as soon as they were out of the house, while he went to find or to wait for his dear Hattie. But his mother did not know all this, and Kit did not tell her. The quick poison of the unreal life about her had already begun to affect her character. She had grown secretive and sly. The innocent longing which in a burst of enthusiasm she had expressed that first night at the theatre was growing into a real ambition with her, and she dropped the simple old songs she knew to practise the detestable coon ditties which the stage demanded. She showed no particular pleasure when her mother found the sort of place they wanted, but went to work with her in sullen silence. Mrs. Hamilton could not understand it all, and many a night she wept and prayed over the change in this child of her heart. There were times when she felt that there was nothing left to work or fight for. The letters from Barry in prison became fewer and fewer. He was sinking into the dull, dead routine of his life. Her own letters to him fell off. It was hard getting the children to write. They did not want to be bothered, and she could not write for herself. So in the weeks and months that followed she drifted farther away from her children and husband and all the traditions of her life. After Joe's first night at the Banner Club, he had kept his promise to Hattie Sterling and had gone often to meet her. She had taught him much, because it was to her advantage to do so. His greenness had dropped from him like a garment, but no amount of sophistication could make him deem the woman less perfect. He knew that she was much older than he, but he only took this fact as an additional sign of his prowess in having won her. He was proud of himself when he went behind the scenes at the theatre, or waited for her at the stage door, and bore her off under the admiring eyes of a crowd of gapers. And Hattie? She liked him in a half contemptuous, half amused way. He was a good-looking boy, and made money enough, as she expressed it, to show her a good time, so she was willing to overlook his weakness and his callow vanity. "Look here," she said to him one day, "I guess you'll have to be moving. There's a young lady been inquiring for you today, and I won't stand for that." He looked at her, startled for a moment, until he saw the laughter in her eyes. Then he caught her and kissed her. "What are you giving me?" he said. "It's a straight tip, that's what." "Who is it?" "It's a girl named Minty Brown, from your home." His face turned brick red with fear and shame. "Minty Brown," he stammered. Had that girl told all and undone him? But Hattie was going on about her work, and evidently knew nothing. "Oh, you needn't pretend you don't know her," she went on banteringly. "She says you were great friends down south, so I've invited her to supper. She wants to see you." To supper, he thought. Was she mocking him? Was she restraining her scorn of him, only to make his humiliation the greater after a while? He looked at her, but there was no suspicion of malice in her face, and he took hope. "Well, I'd like to see old Minty," he said. "It's been a long time since I've seen her." All that afternoon, after going to the barber shop, Joe was driven by a tempest of conflicting emotions. If Minty Brown had not told his story, why not? Would she yet tell, and if she did, what would happen? He tortured himself by questioning if Hattie would cast him off. At the very thought his hand trembled, and the man in the chair asked him if he hadn't been drinking. When he met Minty in the evening, however, the first glance at her reassured him. Her face was wreathed in smiles as she came forward and held out her hand. "Well, well, Joe Hamilton," she exclaimed, "if I ain't right down glad to see you. How are you?" "I'm middlin', Minty. How's yourself?" He was so happy that he couldn't have let her go her hand. "And just look at the boy. If he ain't got the impudence to be wearing a mustache, too. You must have been letting the cats lick your upper lip. Didn't expect to see me in New York, did you?" "No, indeed. What are you doing here?" "Oh, I got a gentleman friend what's a porter, and his run's been changed so that he comes here, and he told me if I wanted to come he'd bring me through for a visit. So you see, here I am. I always was mighty anxious to see this here town. But tell me, how's Kit and your ma?" "They're both right well." He had forgotten them and their scorn of Minty. "Where do you live? I'll come around to see 'em." He hesitated for a moment. He knew how his mother, if not Kit, would receive her, and yet he dared not anger this woman who had his fate in the hollow of her hand. She saw his hesitation and spoke up. "Oh, that's all right. Let bygones be bygones. You know I ain't the kind of person that holds a grudge agin nobody." "That's right, Minty, that's right," he said, and gave her his mother's address. Then he hastened home to prepare the way for Minty's coming. Joe had no doubt but that his mother would see the matter quite as he saw it, and be willing to temporize with Minty. But he had reckoned without his host. Mrs. Hamilton might make certain concessions to strangers on the score of expediency, but she absolutely refused to yield one iota of her dignity to one whom she had known so long as an inferior. "But don't you see what she can do for us, ma? She knows people that I know, and she can ruin me with them." "I ain't never bowed my head to Minty Brown, and I ain't going to do it now," was his mother's only reply. "Oh, ma," Kitty put in, "you don't want to get talked about up here, do you? We'd just as well be talked about for something we didn't do as for something we did do, and it wouldn't be long afore we'd come to that if we made friends with that Brown gal." "I ain't a going to do it. I'm ashamed of you, Kitty, for wanting me to." The girl began to cry, while her brother walked the floor angrily. "You'll see what'll happen," he cried. "You'll see." Fannie looked at her son, and she seemed to see him more clearly than she had ever seen him before, his foppery, his meanness, his cowardice. "Well," she answered with a sigh, "it can't be no wuss than has already happened." You'll see," the boy reiterated. Minty Brown allowed no wind of thought to cool the fire of her determination. She left Hattie Sterling soon after Joe, and he was still walking the floor and uttering dire forebodings when she rang the bell below and asked for the Hamiltons. Mrs. Jones ushered her into her fearfully upholstered parlour, and then puffed upstairs to tell her lodgers that there was a friend here from the South who wanted to see them. "Tell her," said Mrs. Hamilton, "dey ain't no one hyeh wants to see her." "No, no," Kitty broke in. "Hush," said her mother. "I'm going to boss you a little while yet." "Well, I don't understand you, Mrs. Hamilton," puffed Mrs. Jones. "She's a nice looking lady, and she said she knowed you at home." "All you got to do is tell that 'oman just what I say." Minty Brown downstairs had heard the little colloquy, and perceiving that something was amiss, had come to the stairs to listen. Now her voice, striving hard to be condescending and sweet, but growing harsh with anger, floated up from below. "Oh, never mind, lady. I ain't anxious to see 'em. I just called out of pity, but I reckon dey ashamed to see me 'cause de old man's in penitentiary and dey was run out of town." Mrs. Jones gasped, and then turned and went hastily downstairs. Kit burst out crying afresh, and Joe walked the floor muttering beneath his breath, while the mother sat grimly watching the outcome. Finally they heard Mrs. Jones' step once more on the stairs. She came in without knocking, and her manner was distinctly unpleasant. "Miss Hamilton," she said, "I've had a talk with the lady downstairs, and she's told me everything. I'd be glad if you'd let me have my rooms as soon as possible." "So you going to put me out on de word of a stranger?" "I'm kinder sorry, but everybody in the house heard what Miss Brown said, and it'll soon be all over town, and that 'ud ruin the reputation of my house." "I reckon all dat can be 'splained." "Yes, but I don't know that anybody can explain your daughter always being with Mr. Thomas, who ain't even divorced from his wife." She flashed a vindictive glance at the girl, who turned deadly pale and dropped her head in her hands. "You dare to say dat, Mrs. Jones? You dat fust introduced my gal to dat man, and got her to go out with him? I reckon you'd better go now." And Mrs. Jones looked at Fannie's face and obeyed. As soon as the woman's back was turned, Joe burst out, "There, there! See what you've done with your damn foolishness?" Fannie turned on him like a tigress. "Don't you cuss here before me. I ain't never brung you up to it, and I won't stand it. Go to dem where you learned it, and where de words sound sweet." The boy started to speak, but she checked him. "Don't you dare to cuss again, or before God there'll be something for one of this family to be rotting in the jail for." The boy was cowed by his mother's manner. He was gathering his few belongings in a bundle. "I ain't going to cuss," he said sullenly. "I'm going out of your way." "Oh, go on," she said. "Go on. It's been a long time since you been my son. You on your way to hell, and you's been fool, oh, these many days." Joe got out of the house as soon as possible. He did not speak to Kit nor look at his mother. He felt like a cur because he knew deep down in his heart that he had only been waiting for some excuse to take this step. As he slammed the door behind him, his mother flung herself down by Kit's side and mingled her tears with her daughter's, but Kit did not raise her head. "Dey ain't nothin' left but you now, Kit." But the girl did not speak. She only shook with hard sobs. Then her mother raised her head and almost screamed. "My God, not you, Kit!" The girl rose, and then dropped unconscious in her mother's arms. Joe took his clothes to a lodging house that he knew of, and then went to the club to drink himself up to the point of going to see Hattie after the show. Chapter 11. Broken Hopes. What Joe Hamilton lacked more than anything else in the world was someone to kick him. Many a man who might have lived decently and became a fairly respectable citizen has gone to the dogs for the want of someone to administer a good resounding kick at the right time. It is corrective and clarifying. Joe needed especially its clarifying property, for though he knew himself a cur, he went away from his mother's house feeling himself somehow aggrieved, and the feeling grew upon him the more he thought of it. His mother had ruined his chance in life, and he could never hold up his head again. Yes, he had heard that several of the fellows at the club had shady reputations, but surely to be the son of a thief, or a supposed thief, was not like being the criminal himself. At the Banner he took a seat by himself and ordered a cocktail, sat glowering at the few other lonely members who had happened to drop in. There were not many of them, and the contagion of unsociability had taken possession of the house. The people sat scattered around at different tables, perfectly unmindful of the bartender, who cursed them under his breath for not getting together. Joe's mind was filled with bitter thoughts. How long had he been away from home, he asked himself. Nearly a year, Nearly a year passed in New York, and he had come to be what he so much desired, a part of its fast life, and now in a moment an old woman's stubbornness had destroyed all that he had builded. What would Thomas say when he heard of it? What would the other fellows think? And Hattie? It was plain that she would never notice him again. He had no doubt but that the malice of Minty Brown would prompt her to seek all of his friends and make the story known. Why had he not tried to placate her by disavowing sympathy with his mother? He would have had no compunction about doing so, but he had thought of it too late. He sat brooding over his trouble until the bartender called with respectful sarcasm to ask if he wanted to lease the glass he had. He gave back a silly laugh, gulped the rest of the liquor down, and was ordering another when Sadness came in. He came up directly to Joe and sat down beside him. "Mr. Hamilton says make it two, Jack," he said with easy familiarity. "Well, what's the matter, old man? You're looking glum." "I feel glum." "The divine Hattie hasn't been cutting any capers, has she? The dear old girl hasn't been getting hysterical at her age. Let us hope not." Joe glared at him. Why in the devil should this fellow be so sadly gay when he was weighted down with sorrow and shame and disgust? "Come, come now, Hamilton, if you're sore because I invited myself to take a drink with you, I'll withdraw the order. I know the heroic thing to say is that I'll pay for the drinks myself, but I can't screw up my courage up to the point of doing so unnatural a thing." Young Hamilton hastened to protest. "Oh, I know you fellows now well enough to know how many drinks to pay for. It ain't that." "Well, then, out with it. What is it? Haven't been up to anything, have you?" The desire came to Joe to tell this man the whole truth, just what was the matter, and so to relieve his heart. On the impulse he did. If he had expected much from Sadness, he was disappointed, for not a muscle of the man's face changed during the entire recital. When it was over, he looked at his companion critically through a wreath of smoke, and then he said, "For a fellow who has had for a full year the advantage of the education of the New York clubs, you are strangely young. Let me see, you are 19 or 20 now, yes. Well, that perhaps accounts for it. It's a pity you weren't born older. It's a pity most men aren't. They wouldn't have to take so much time and lose so many good things learning. Now, Mr. Hamilton, let me tell you, and you will pardon me for it, that you are a fool. Your case isn't half as bad as that of 9/10 of the fellows that hang around here. Now, for instance, my father was hung." Joe started and gave a gasp of horror. "Oh, yes, but it was done with a very good rope and by the best citizens of Texas. So it seems that I really ought to be grateful to them for the distinction they conferred upon my family. But I am not. I'm ungratefully sad. A man must be very high or very low to take the sensible view of life that keeps him from being sad. I must confess that I have aspired to the depths without ever being fully able to reach them. Now look around a bit. See that little girl over there? That's Viola. 2 years ago she wrenched up an iron stool from the floor of a lunchroom and killed another woman with it. She's 19, just about your age, by the way. Well, she had friends with a certain amount of pull. She got out of it, and no one thinks the worse of Viola. You see, Hamilton, in this life we are all suffering from fever, and no one judges away from the other because he finds him a little warm. It's dangerous when you're not used to it, but once you go through the parching process, you become inoculated against further contagion. Now there's Barney over there, as decent a fellow as I know, but he has been indicted twice for pocket picking. A half dozen fellows whom you meet here every night have killed their man. Others have done worse things for which you respect them less. Poor Wallace, who is just coming in and who looks like a jaunty rag picker, came here about 6 months ago with about $2,000, the proceeds from the sale of a house his father had left him. He'll sleep in one of the club chairs tonight, and not from choice. He spent his $2,000 learning. But after all, it was a good investment. It was like buying an annuity. He begins to know already how to live on others as they have lived on him. The plucked bird's beak is sharpened for others' feathers. From now on Wallace will live, eat, drink, and sleep at the expense of others, and will forget to mourn his lost money. He will go on this way until broken and useless, the poorhouse or the potter's field gets him. Oh, it's a fine, rich life, my lad. I know you'll like it. I said you would the first time I saw you. It has plenty of stir in it, and a man never gets lonesome. Only the rich are lonesome. It's only the independent who depend upon others." Sadness laughed a peculiar laugh, and there was a look in his terribly bright eyes that made Joe creep. If he could only have understood all that man was saying to him, he might have yet turned back. But he didn't. He ordered another drink. The only effect that the talk of sadness had upon him was to make him feel wonderfully "in it." It gave him a false bravery, and he mentally told himself that now he would not be afraid to face Hattie. He put out his hand to Sadness with a knowing look. "Thanks, Sadness. You've helped me lots." Sadness brushed the proffered hand away and sprung up. "You lie," he cried. "I haven't. I was only fool enough to try." And he turned hastily away from the table. Joe looked surprised at first, and then laughed at his friend's retreating form. "Poor old fellow," he said. "Drunk again. Must have had something before he came in." There was not a lie in all that Sadness had said, either as to their crime or their condition. He belonged to a peculiar class, one that grows larger and larger each year in New York, and which has imitators in every large city in this country. It is a set which lives, like the leech, upon the blood of others, that draws its life from the veins of foolish men and immoral women, that prides itself upon its well-dressed idleness and has no shame in its voluntary pauperism. Each member of the class knows every other, his methods, and his limitations, and their loyalty one to another make of them a great hulking fashionably uniform fraternity of indolence. Some play the races a few months of the year, others quite as intermittently gamble at shoestring politics and waver from party to party as time or their interests seem to dictate, but mostly they are like the lilies of the field. It was into this set that Sadness had sarcastically invited Joe, and Joe felt honoured. He found that all of his former feelings had been silly and quite out of place, that all he had learned in his earlier years was false. It was very plain to him now that to want a good reputation was a sign of unpardonable immaturity, and that dishonour was the only real thing worth while. It made him feel better. He was just rising bravely to swagger out to the theatre when Minty Brown came in with one of the clubmen he knew. He bowed and smiled, but she appeared not to notice him at first, and when she did she nudged her companion and laughed. Suddenly his little courage began to ooze out, and he knew what she must be saying to the fellow at her side, for he looked over at him and grinned. Where now was the philosophy of Sadness? Evidently Minty had not been brought up under its educating influences, and thought about the whole matter in the old ignorant way. He began to think of it too. Somehow old teachings and old traditions have an annoying way of coming back upon us in the critical moments of life, although one has long ago recognized how much truer and better some newer ways of thinking are. But Joe would not allow Minty to shatter his dreams by bringing up these old notions. She must be instructed. He rose and went over to her table. "Why, Minty," he said, offering his hand, "you ain't mad at me, are you?" "Go away from here," she said angrily. "I don't want none of thieving Berry Hamilton's family to speak to me." "Why, you are all right this evening." "Yes, but just out of pity, and you was nice because you was afraid I'd tell on you. Go on now." "Go on now," said Minty's young man, and he looked menacing. Joe, what little respect he had gone, slunk out of the room, and needed several whiskies in a neighbouring saloon to give him courage to go to the theatre and wait for Hattie, who was playing in vaudeville houses pending the opening of her company. The closing act was just over when he reached the stage door. He was there but a short time when Hattie tripped out and took his arm. Her face was bright and smiling, and there was no suggestion of disgust in the dancing eyes she turned up to him. Evidently she had not heard, but the thought gave him no particular pleasure, as it left him in suspense as to how she would act when she should hear. "Let's go somewhere and get some supper," she said. "I'm as hungry as I can be. What are you looking so cut up about?" "Oh, I ain't feeling so very good." "I hope you ain't letting that long-tongued brown woman bother your head, are you?" His heart seemed to stand still. She did know, then. "Do you know all about it?" "Why, of course I do. You might know she'd come to me first with her story." "And you still keep on speaking to me? Now look here, Joe, if you've been drinking I'll forgive you. If you ain't, you go on and leave me. Say, what do you take me for? Do you think I'd throw down a friend because somebody else talked about him? Well, you don't know Hat Sterling. When Minty told me that story she was back in my dressing room, and I sent her out of there a-flying, and with a tongue lashing that she won't forget for a month of Sundays. I reckon that was the reason she jumped on me so hard at the club." He chuckled. He had taken heart again. All that Sadness had said was true, after all, and people thought no less of him. His joy was unbounded. "So she jumped on you hard, did she? The cat! Oh, she didn't say a thing to me. Well, Joe, it's like this. I ain't no angel, you know that, but I do try to be square, and whenever I find a friend of mine down on his luck, in his pocketbook or his feelings, why, I give him my flipper. Why, old chap, I believe I like you better for the stiff upper lip you've been keeping under all this. Why, Hattie, he broke out, unable any longer to control himself, you're, oh, I'm just plain Hat Sterling, who won't throw down her friends. Now come on and get something to eat. If that thing is at the club, we'll go there and show her just how much her talk amounted to. She thinks she's the whole game, but I can spot her and then show her that she ain't 1, 2, 3. When they reached the Banner, they found Minty still there. She tried on the two the same tactics that she had employed so successfully upon Joe alone. She nudged her companion and tittered, but she had another person to deal with. Hattie Sterling stared at her coldly and indifferently and passed on by her to her seat. Joe proceeded to order supper and other things in the nonchalant way that the woman had enjoined upon him. Minty began to feel distinctly uncomfortable, but it was her business not to be beaten. She laughed outright. Hattie did not seem to hear her. She was beckoning Sadness to her side. He came and sat down. "Now look here," she said. "You can't have any supper because you haven't reached the stage of magnificent hunger to make a meal palatable to you. You've got so used to being nearly starved that a meal don't taste good to you under any other circumstances. You're in on the drinks, though. Your thirst is always available. Jack," she called down the long room to the bartender, "make it 3. Lean over here. I want to talk to you. See that woman over there by the wall? No, not that one. The big light woman with Griggs. Well, she's come here with a story trying to throw Joe down, and I want you to help me to do her." "Oh, that's the one that upset our young friend, is it?" said Sadness, turning his mournful eyes upon Minty. "That's her. So you know about it, do you?" "Yes, and I'll help do her. She mustn't touch one of the fraternity, you know." He kept his eyes fixed upon the outsider until she squirmed. She could not at all understand this serious conversation directed at her. She wondered if she had gone too far, and if they contemplated putting her out. It made her uneasy. Now this same Miss Sterling had the faculty of attracting a good deal of attention when she wished to. She brought it into play to night, and in 10 minutes, aided by Sadness, she had a crowd of jolly people about her table. When, as she would have expressed it, everything was going fat, she suddenly paused, and turning her eyes full upon Minty, said in a voice loud enough for all to hear: "Say, boys, you've heard that story about Joe, haven't you?" They had. "Well, that's the one that told it. She come here to try to throw him and me down. Is she going to do it?" "Well, I guess not," was the rousing reply, and every face turned towards the now frightened Minty. She rose hastily, and getting her skirts together, fled from the room, followed more leisurely by the crestfallen Griggs. Hattie's laugh and "Thank you, fellows," followed her out. Matters were less easy for Joe's mother and sister than they were for him. A week or more after this, Kitty found him and told him that Minty's story had reached their employers, and that they were out of work. "You see, Joe," she said sadly, "we've took a flat since we moved from Mrs. Jones, and we had to furnish it. We've got one lodger, a racehorse man, and he's mighty nice to Ma and me. That ain't enough. Now we've got to do something." Joe was so smitten with sorrow that he gave her $1 and promised to speak about the matter to a friend of his. He did speak about it to Hattie. "You've told me once or twice that your sister could sing. Bring her down here to me, and if she can do anything, I'll get her a place on the stage," was Hattie's answer. When Kitty heard it she was radiant, but her mother only shook her head and said, "The last hope, the last hope." End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12. All the World's a Stage. Kitty proved herself Joe's sister by falling desperately in love with Hattie Sterling the first time they met. The actress was very gracious to her, and called her "child" in a pretty patronizing way, and patted her on the cheek. "It's a shame that Joe hasn't brought you around before. We've been good friends for quite some time. He told me you and him was right good friends." Already Joe took on a new importance in his sister's eyes. He must be quite a man, she thought, to be the friend of such a person as Miss Sterling. "So you think you want to go on the stage, do you?" "Yes'm. I thought it might be right nice for me if I could. Joe, go out and get some beer for us, and then I'll hear your sister sing. Miss Sterling talked as if she were a manager, and had only to snap her fingers to be obeyed. When Joe came back with the beer, Kitty drank a glass. She did not like it, but she would not offend her hostess. After this she sang, and Miss Sterling applauded her generously, although the young girl's nervousness kept her from doing her best. The encouragement helped her, and she did better as she became more at home. Why, child, you've got a good voice. And Joe, you've been keeping her shut up all this time. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. The young man had little to say. He had brought Kitty almost under a protest because he had no confidence in her ability and thought that his girl would disillusion her. It did not please him now to find his sister so fully under the limelight and himself upstage. Kitty was quite in a flutter of delight, not so much with the idea of working as with the glamour of the work she might be allowed to do. I tell you now, Hattie Sterling pursued, throwing a brightly stockinged foot upon a chair, your voice is too good for the chorus. Give me a cigarette, Joe. Have one, Kitty? I'm going to call you Kitty. It's nice and homelike, and then we've got to be great chums, you know. Kitty, unwilling to refuse anything from the sorceress, took her cigarette and lighted it, but a few puffs set her off coughing. Tut tut, Kitty child, don't do it if you ain't used to it. You'll learn soon enough. Joe wanted to kick his sister for having tried so delicate an art and failed, for he had not yet lost all of his awe of Hattie. Now, what I was going to say, the lady resumed after several contemplative puffs, is that you'll have to begin in the chorus anyway and work your way up. It wouldn't take long for you, with your looks and voice, to put one of the up-and-ups out of business. Only hope it won't be me. I've had people I've helped try to do it often enough. She gave a laugh that had just a touch of bitterness in it, for she began to recognize that although she had been on the stage only a short time, she was no longer the all-conquering Hattie Sterling in the first freshness of her youth. Oh, I wouldn't want to push anybody out, Kit expostulated. Oh, never mind you. You'll soon get bravely over that feeling, and even if you didn't, it wouldn't matter much. The thing has to happen. Somebody's got to go down. We don't last long in this life. It soon wears us out, and when we're worn out and sung out, danced out and played out, the manager has no further use for us, so he reduces us to the ranks or kicks us out entirely. Joe here thought it time for him to put in a word. Get out, Hat, he said contemptuously. You're good for a dozen years yet. She didn't deign to notice him, save so far as a sniff goes. Don't you let what I say scare you, though, Kitty. You've got a good chance, and maybe you'll have more sense than I've got, and at least save money while you're in it. But let's get off that. It makes me sick. All you've got to do is to come to the Opera House tomorrow, and I'll introduce you to the manager. He's a fool, but I think we can make him do something for you." "Oh, thank you. I'll be around tomorrow, sure." "Better come about 10 o'clock. There's a rehearsal tomorrow, and you'll find him there. Of course, he'll be pretty rough, and he always is at rehearsals, but he'll take to you if he thinks there's something in you and he can get it out." Kitty felt herself dismissed and rose to go. Joe did not rise. "I'll see you later, Kit," he said. "I ain't going just yet. Say," he added when his sister was gone, "you're a hot one. What do you want to give her all that con for? She'll never get in." "Joe," said Hattie, "don't you get awful tired of being a jackass? Sometimes I want to kiss you, and sometimes I feel as if I had to kick you. I'll compromise with you now by letting you bring me some more beer. This got all stale while your sister was here. I saw she didn't like it, and so I wouldn't drink any more for fear she'd try to keep up with me." "Kit is a good deal of a jay yet," Joe remarked wisely. "Oh, yes, this world is full of jays. Lots of 'em have seen enough to make 'em wise, but they're still jays and don't know it. That's the worst of it. They go around thinking they're it, when they ain't even in the game. Go on and get the beer." And Joe went, feeling vaguely that he had been sat upon. Kit flew home with joyous heart to tell her mother of her good prospects. She burst into the room crying, "Oh, Ma, Ma, Miss Hattie thinks I'll do to go on the stage. Ain't it grand?" She did not meet with the expected warmth of response from her mother. "I don't know as it'll be so grand. On what I see of them stage people, they don't seem to mount much. The way them gals shows themselves is right down bad to me. Is you goin' to dress like them we seen that night?" Kit hung her head. "I guess I'll have to." "Well, if you have to, I'd rather see you dead any day. Oh, Kit, my little gal, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't you go down like your brother Joe. Joe's gone." "Why, Ma, you don't understand. Joe's somebody now. You ought to have heard how Miss Hattie talked about him. She said he's been her friend for a long while." "Her friend?" "Yes, and his own enemy. You needn't pattern after that gal, Kit. She ruined Joe, and she's after you now. But nowadays everybody thinks stage people respectable up here. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I can't believe in any woman's ladyship when she shows herself like them gals does. Oh, Kit, don't do it. Ain't you seen enough? Don't you know enough already to stay from these up people? They don't want nothing but to pull you down and then laugh at you when you's dragged in the dust." "You mustn't feel that way, Ma. I'm doing it to help you." "I don't want no such help. I'd rather starve." Kit did not reply, but there was no yielding in her manner. "Kit," her mother went on, "there's something I ain't never told you that I'm goin' to tell you now. Mr. Gibson us to come to Miss Jones's lots to see me before we move here. And he's been talking about a good many things to me." She hesitated. "He say that I ain't no ways mad to my poor husband, that a penitentiary sentence is the same as a divorce, and if they should live to get out, we'd have to marry again. I wouldn't mind that, Kit, but he say that at Bay's age, they ain't much chance of his living to get out, and yeah, I'll live all this time alone, and then have no one to take care of me when I get old. He wants me to marry him, Kit. Kit, I love your father. He's my only one. But Joe, he's gone, and if you go, before God, I'll tell Tom Gibson yes." The mother looked up to see just what effect her plea would have on her daughter. She hoped that what she said would have the desired result, but the girl turned around from fixing her neck ribbon before the glass, her face radiant. "Why, it'll be splendid. He's such a nice man, and racehorse men most always have money. Why don't you marry him, Ma? And I'd feel that you was safe and settled, and that you wouldn't be lonesome when the show was out of town." "You want me to marry him and desert your poor Pa?" "I guess what he says is right, Ma. I don't reckon we'll ever see Pa again, and you got to do something. You got to live for yourself now." Her mother dropped her head in her hands. "All right," she said. "I'll do it. I'll marry him. Might as well go the way both my children's gone. Poor Bay. Poor Bay. If you ever do come out, God help you to bear what you'll find." And Mrs. Hamilton rose and tottered from the room, as if the old age she anticipated had already come upon her. Kit stood looking after her, fear and grief in her eyes. "Poor Ma," she said, "and poor Pa. But I know, and I know it's for the best." On the next morning she was up early and practicing hard for her interview with the managing star of Martin's Blackbirds. When she arrived at the theater, Hattie Sterling met her with frank friendliness. "I'm glad you came early, Kitty," she remarked, "for maybe you can get a chance to talk with Martin before he begins rehearsal and gets all worked up. He'll be a little less like a bear then, but even if you don't see him before then, wait, and don't get scared if he tries to bluff you. His bark is a good deal worse than his bite." When Mr. Martin came in that morning, he had other ideas than that of seeing applicants for places. His show must begin in 2 weeks, and it was advertised to be larger and better than ever before, when really nothing at all had been done for it. The promise of this advertisement must be fulfilled. Mr. Martin was late and was out of humor with everyone else on account of it. He came in hurried, fierce, and important. "Morning, Mr. Smith. Morning, Mrs. Jones. Ha! Ladies and gentlemen, all here?" He shot every word out of his mouth as if the aftertaste of it were unpleasant to him. He walked among the chorus like an angry king among his vassals, and his glance was a flash of insolent fire. From his head to his feet he was the very epitome of self-sufficient, brutal conceit. Kitty trembled as she noted the hush that fell on the people at his entrance. She felt like rushing out of the room. She could never face this terrible man. She trembled more as she found his eyes fixed upon her. "Who's that?" he asked, disregarding her as if she had been a stick or a stone. "Well, don't snap her head off. It's a girlfriend of mine that wants a place," said Hattie. She was the only one who would brave Martin. "Humph. Let her wait. I ain't got no time to hear anyone now. Get yourselves in line, you all who are on to that first chorus, while I'm getting into my sweatshirt." He disappeared behind a screen, whence he emerged arrayed, or only half arrayed, in a thick absorbing shirt and a thin pair of woolen trousers. Then the work began. The man was indefatigable. He was like the spirit of energy. He was in every place about the stage at once, leading the chorus, showing them steps, twisting some awkward girl into shape, shouting, gesticulating, abusing the pianist. Now, he shouted, "the left foot on that beat, ba, ba, stop. You walk like a lot of tin soldiers. Are your joints rusty? Do you want oil? Look here, Taylor, if I didn't know you, I'd take you for a truck. Pick up your feet, open your mouths, and move, move, move. Oh!" And he would drop his head in despair. "And to think that I've got to do something with these things in 2 weeks. 2 weeks!" Then he would turn to them again with a sudden reaccession of eagerness. "Now at it again, at it again. Hold that note, hold it. Now whirl, and on the left foot. Stop that music, stop it. Miss Coster, you'll learn that step in about 1,000 years, and I've got 999 years and 50 weeks less time than that to spare. Come here and try that step with me. Don't be afraid to move. Sip like a chicken on a hot griddle." And some blushing girl would come forward and go through the step alone before all the rest. Kitty contemplated the scene with a mind equally divided between fear and anger. What should she do if he would so speak to her? Like the others, no doubt, smile sheepishly and obey him. But she did not like to believe it. She felt that the independence which she had known from babyhood would assert itself, and that she would talk back to him even as Hattie Sterling did. She felt scared and discouraged, but every now and then her friends smiled encouragingly upon her across the ranks of moving singers. Finally, however, her thoughts were broken in upon by hearing Mr. Martin cry, "Ah, quit! Quit and go rest yourselves, you ancient pieces of hickory, and let me forget you for a minute before I go crazy. Where's that new girl now?" Kitty rose and went toward him, trembling so that she could hardly walk. "What can you do?" "I can sing," very faintly. "Well, if that's the voice you're going to sing in, there won't be many that'll know whether it's good or bad. Well, let's hear something. Do you know any of these?" And he ran over the titles of several songs. She knew some of them, and he selected one. "Try this. Here, Tom, play it for her." It was an ordeal for the girl to go through. She had never sung before at anything more formidable than a church concert, where only her immediate acquaintances and townspeople were present. Now to sing before all these strange people, themselves singers, made her feel faint and awkward. But the courage of desperation came to her, and she struck into the song. At the first, her voice wavered and threatened to fail her. It must not. She choked back her fright and forced the music from her lips. When she was done, she was startled to hear Martin burst into a raucous laugh. Such humiliation! She had failed, and instead of telling her, he was bringing her to shame before the whole company. The tears came into her eyes, and she was about giving way when she caught a reassuring nod and smile from Hattie Sterling, and seized on this as a last hope. "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Martin. "Ha, ha, ha, ha! The little one was scared, see? She was scared. Do you understand? But did you see the grit she went at it with? Just took the bit in her teeth and got away. Ha, ha, ha! That's what I like. If all you girls had that spirit, we could do something in 2 weeks. Try another one, girl." Kitty's heart had suddenly grown light. She sang the second one better, because something within her was singing. "Good," said Martin, but he immediately returned to his cold manner. "You watch these girls close and see what they do, and tomorrow be prepared to go into line and move as well as sing." He immediately turned his attention from her to the chorus, but no slight that he could inflict upon her now could take away the sweet truth that she was engaged and tomorrow would begin work. She thought kindly of Joe and promised herself to give him a present out of her first month's earnings. On the first night of the show, pretty little Kitty Hamilton was pointed out as a girl who wouldn't be in the chorus long. The mother, who is soon to be Mrs. Gibson, sat in the balcony, a grieved, pained look on her face. Joe was in the front row with some of the rest of the gang. He took many drinks between the acts because he was proud. Mr. Thomas was there. He also was proud, and after the performance he waited for Kitty at the stage door and went forward to meet her as she came out. The look she gave him stopped him, and he let her pass without a word. "Who'd 'a' thought," he mused, "that the kid had that much nerve? Well, if they don't want to find out things, what did they come to New York for? It ain't nobody's old Sunday school picnic. Guess I got out easy anyhow." Hattie Sterling took Joe home in a hansom. "Say," she said, "if you come this way for me again, it's all over, see? Your little sister's a comer, and I've got to hustle to keep up with her." Joe growled and fell asleep in his chair. One must needs have a strong head or a strong will when one is the brother of a celebrity and would celebrate the distinguished one's success.
Chapter 13. The Oakleys. A year after the arrest of Barry Hamilton, and at a time when New York had shown to the eyes of his family so many strange new sights, there were few changes to be noted in the condition of affairs at the Oakley place. Maurice Oakley was perhaps a shade more distrustful of his servants, and consequently more testy with them. Mrs. Oakley was the same acquiescent woman, with unbounded faith in her husband's wisdom and judgment. With complacent minds both went their ways, drank their wine, and said their prayers, and wished that Brother Frank's 5 years were past. They had letters from him now and then, never very cheerful in tone, but always breathing the deepest love and gratitude to them. His brother found deep cause for congratulation in the tone of these epistles. "Frank is getting down to work," he would cry exultantly. "He has passed the first buoyant enthusiasm of youth. Ah, Leslie, when a man begins to be serious, then he begins to be something." And her only answer would be, "I wonder, Maurice, if Claire Lessing will wait for him." The two had frequent questions to answer as to Frank's doing and prospects, and they had always bright things to say of him, even when his letters gave them no such warrant. Their love for him made them read large between the lines, and all they read was good. Between Maurice and his brother, no word of the guilty servant ever passed. They each avoided it as an unpleasant subject. Frank had never asked, and his brother had never proffered aught of the outcome of the case. Mrs. Oakley had once suggested it. "Brother ought to know," she said, "that Barry is being properly punished." "By no means," replied her husband. "You know that it would only hurt him. He shall never know if I have to tell him." "You are right, Maurice, you are always right. We must shield Frank from the pain it would cause him. Poor fellow, he is so sensitive." Their hearts were still steadfastly fixed upon the union of this younger brother with Claire Lessing. She had lately come into a fortune, and there was nothing now to prevent it. They would have written Frank to urge it, but they both believed that to try to woo him away from his art was but to make him more wayward. That any woman could have power enough to take him away from this jealous mistress, they very much doubted. But they could hope, and hope made them eager to open every letter that bore the French postmark. Always it might contain news that he was coming home, or that he had made a great success, or, better, some inquiry after Claire. A long time they had waited, but found no such tidings in the letters from Paris. At last, as Maurice Oakley sat in his library one day, the servant brought him a letter more bulky in weight and appearance than any he had yet received. His eyes glistened with pleasure as he read the postmark. "A letter from Frank," he said joyfully, "and an important one, I'll wager." He smiled as he weighed it in his hand and caressed it. Mrs. Oakley was out shopping, and as he knew how deep her interest was, he hesitated to break the seal before she returned. He curbed his natural desire and laid the heavy envelope down on the desk, but he could not deny himself the pleasure of speculating as to its contents. It was such a large, interesting-looking package. What might it not contain? It simply reeked of possibilities. Had any one banteringly told Maurice Oakley that he had such a deep vein of sentiment, he would have denied it with scorn and laughter. But here he found himself sitting with the letter in his hand and weaving stories as to its contents. First, now, it might be noticed that Frank had received the badge of the Legion of Honor. No, no, that was too big, and he laughed aloud at his own folly, wondering the next minute, with half shame, why he laughed, for did he, after all, believe anything was too big for that brother of his? Well, let him begin, anyway, away down. Let him say, for instance, that the letter told of the completion and sale of a great picture. Frank had sold small ones. He would be glad of this, for his brother had written him several times of things that were a-doing, but not yet of anything that was done. Or better yet, let the letter say that some picture, long finished, but of which the artist's pride and anxiety had forbidden him to speak, had made a glowing success, the success it deserved. This sounded well, and seemed not at all beyond the bounds of possibility. It was an alluring vision. He saw the picture already. It was a scene from life, true in detail to the point of very minuteness, and yet with something spiritual in it that lifted it above the mere copy of the commonplace. At the salon it would be hung on the line, and people would stand before it, admiring its workmanship and asking who the artist was. He drew on his memory of old reading. In his mind's eye he saw Frank, unconscious of his own power, or too modest to admit it, stand unknown among the crowds around his picture, waiting for and dreading their criticisms. He saw the light leap to his eyes as he heard their words of praise. He saw the straightening of his narrow shoulders when he was forced to admit that he was the painter of the work. Then the windows of Paris were filled with his portraits. The papers were full of his praise, and brave men and fair women met together to do him homage. Fair women, yes, and Frank would look upon them all and see reflected in them but a tithe of the glory of one woman, and that woman, Claire Lessing. He roused himself and laughed again as he tapped the magic envelope. "My fancies go on and conquer the world for my brother," he muttered. He will follow their flight one day and do it himself. The letter drew his eyes back to it. It seemed to invite him, to beg him even. No, I will not do it. I will wait until Leslie comes. She will be as glad to hear the good news as I am. His dreams were taking the shape of reality in his mind, and he was believing all that he wanted to believe. He turned to look at a picture painted by Frank which hung over the mantel. He dwelt lovingly upon it, seeing in it the touch of a genius. Surely, he said, this new picture cannot be greater than that, though it shall hang where kings can see it, and this only graces the library of my poor house. It has the feeling of a woman's soul with the strength of a man's heart. When Frank and Claire marry, I shall give it back to them. It is too great a treasure for a clod like me. Hi-ho, why will women be so long a-shopping? He glanced again at the letter, and his hand went out involuntarily towards it. He fondled it, smiling. Ah, Lady Leslie, I've a mind to open it to punish you for staying so long. He essayed to be playful, but he knew that he was trying to make a compromise with himself because his eagerness grew stronger than his gallantry. He laid the letter down and picked it up again. He studied the postmark over and over. He got up and walked to the window and back again, and then began fumbling in his pockets for his knife. No, he did not want it. Yes, he did. He would just cut the envelope and make believe he had read it to pique his wife, but he would not read it. Yes, that was it. He found the knife and slit the paper. His fingers trembled as he touched the sheets that protruded. Why would Leslie not come? Did she not know that he was waiting for her? She ought to have known that there was a letter from Paris today, for it had been a month since they had had one. There was a sound of footsteps without. He sprang up, crying, I've been waiting so long for you. A servant opened the door to bring him a message. Oakley dismissed him angrily. What did he want to go down to the Continental for, to drink and talk politics to a lot of muddle-pated fools, when he had a brother in Paris who was an artist, and a letter from him lay unread in his hand? His patience and temper were going. Leslie was careless and unfeeling. She ought to come. He was tired of waiting. A carriage rolled up the driveway, and he dropped the letter guiltily, as if it were not his own. He would only say that he had grown tired of waiting and started to read it. But it was only Mrs. Davis's footman, leaving a note for Leslie about some charity. He went back to the letter. Well, it was his. Leslie had forfeited a right to see it as soon as he. It might be mean, but it was not dishonest. No, he would not read it now, but he would take it out and show her that he had exercised his self-control in spite of her shortcomings. He laid it on the desk once more. It leered at him. He might just open the sheets enough to see the lines that began it and read no further. Yes, he would do that. Leslie could not feel hurt at such a little thing. The first line had only, Dear brother. Dear brother! Why not the second? That could not hold much more. The second line held him, and the third, and the fourth as he read on, unmindful now of what Leslie might think or feel. His face turned from the ruddy glow of pleasant anxiety to the pallor of grief and terror. He was not halfway through it when Mrs. Oakley's voice in the hall announced her coming. He did not hear her. He sat staring at the page before him, his lips apart and his eyes staring. Then, with a cry that echoed through the house, crumpling the sheets in his hand, he fell forward, fainting to the floor, just as his wife rushed into the room. What is it? She cried. Maurice! Maurice! He lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, the letter clutched in his hands. She ran to him and lifted up his head, but he gave no sign of life. Already the servants were crowding to the door. She bade one of them to hasten for a doctor, others to bring water and brandy, and the rest to be gone. As soon as she was alone, she loosed the crumpled sheets from his hand, for she felt that this must have been the cause of her husband's strange attack. Without a thought of wrong, for they had no secrets from each other, she glanced at the opening lines. Then she forgot the unconscious man at her feet, and read the letter through to the end. The letter was in Frank's neat hand, a little shaken perhaps by nervousness. Dear brother, it ran, I know you will grieve at receiving this, and I wish that I might bear your grief for you, but I cannot, though I have as heavy a burden as this can bring to you. Mine would have been lighter today, perhaps, had you been more straightforward with me. I am not blaming you, however, for I know that my hypocrisy made you believe me possessed of a really soft heart, and you thought to spare me. Until yesterday, when in a letter from Esterton he casually mentioned the matter, I did not know that Barry was in prison, else this letter would have been written sooner. I have been wanting to write it for so long, and yet have been too great a coward to do so. I know that you will be disappointed in me, and just what that disappointment will cost you I know, but you must hear the truth. I shall never see your face again, or I should not dare to tell it even now. You will remember that I begged you to be easy on your servant. You thought it was only my kindness of heart. It was not. I had a deeper reason. I knew where the money had gone, and dared not to tell. Barry is innocent as yourself, and well, it is a story, and let me tell it to you. You have had so much confidence in me, and I hate to tell you that it was all misplaced. I have no doubt that I should not be doing it now, but that I have drunken absinthe enough to give me the emotional point of view, which I shall regret tomorrow. I do not mean that I am drunk. I can think clearly and write clearly, but my emotions are extremely active. Do you remember Claire's saying at the table that night of the farewell dinner that some dark-eyed mademoiselle was waiting for me? She did not know how truly she spoke, though I fancy she saw how I flushed when she said it, for I was already in love, madly so. I need not describe her. I need say nothing about her, for I know that nothing I say can ever persuade you to forgive her for taking me from you. This has gone on since I first came here, and I dared not tell you, for I saw whither your eyes had turned. I loved this girl, and she both inspired and hindered my work. Perhaps I would have been successful had I not met her. Perhaps not. I love her too well to marry her, and make of our devotion a stale, prosy thing of duty and compulsion. When a man does not marry a woman, he must keep her better than he would a wife. It costs. All that you gave me went to make her happy. Then, when I was about leaving you, the catastrophe came. I wanted much to carry back to her. I gambled to make more. I would surprise her. Luck was against me. Night after night I lost. Then, just before the dinner, I woke from my frenzy to find that all I had was gone. I would have asked you for more, and you would have given it, but that strange, ridiculous something which we misname Southern honor, that honor which strains at a gnat and swallows a camel, withheld me, and I preferred to do worse. So I lied to you. The money from my cabinet was not stolen, save by myself. I am a liar and a thief, but your eyes shall never tell me so. Tell the truth and have Barry released. I can stand it. Write me but one letter to tell me of this. Do not plead with me, do not forgive me, do not seek to find me, for from this time I shall be as one who has perished from the earth. I shall be no more. Your brother, Frank. By the time the servants came, they found Mrs. Oakley as white as her lord, but with firm hands and compressed lips she ministered to his needs pending the doctor's arrival. She bathed his face and temples, chafed his hands, and forced the brandy between his lips. Finally he stirred, and his hands gripped. "The letter!" he gasped. "Yes, dear, I have it, I have it." "Give it to me," he cried. She handed it to him. He seized it and thrust it into his breast. Did you read it?" "Yes, I did not know. Oh, my God, I did not intend that you should see it. I wanted the secret for my own. I wanted to carry it to my grave with me. Oh, Frank! 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 Never mind, Maurice. It is as if you alone knew it. It is not, I say, it is not." He turned upon his face and began to weep passionately, not like a man, but like a child whose last toy has been broken. "Oh, my God!" he moaned. "My brother! My brother!" "Shh, dearie, think. It's Frank. That's it! That's it! That's what I can't forget! It's Frank! Frank, my brother!" Suddenly he sat up and his eyes stared straight into hers. "Leslie, no one must ever know what is in this letter," he said calmly. "No one shall, Maurice. Come, let us burn it." "Burn it? No, no," he cried, clutching at his breast. It must not be burned. What? Burn my brother's secret? No, no, I must carry it with me. Carry it with me to the grave. But, Maurice, I must carry it with me. She saw that he was overwrought, and so did not argue with him. When the doctor came, he found Maurice Oakley in bed, but better. The medical man diagnosed the case and decided that he had received some severe shock. He feared too for his heart, for the patient constantly held his hands pressed against his bosom. In vain the doctor pleaded. He would not take them down, and when the wife added her word, the physician gave up, and after prescribing left, much puzzled in mind. It's a strange case, he said. There's something more than nervous shock that makes him clutch his chest like that, and yet I have never noticed signs of heart trouble in Oakley. Oh well, business worry will produce anything in anybody. It was soon common talk about the town about Maurice Oakley's attack. In the seclusion of his chamber he was saying to his wife, "Ah, Leslie, you and I will keep the secret. No one shall ever know." "Yes, dear, but what of Barry?" "What of Barry?" he cried, starting up excitedly. "What is Barry to Frank? What is that nigger to my brother? What are his sufferings to the honor of my family and name?" "Never mind, Maurice, never mind. You are right. It must never be known, I say, if Barry has to rot in jail." So they wrote a lie to Frank, and buried the secret in their breasts, and Oakley wore its visible form upon his heart.
Chapter 14. Frankenstein. 5 years is but a short time in the life of a man, and yet many things may happen therein. For instance, the whole way of a family's life may be changed. Good natures may be made into bad ones, and out of a soul of faith grow a spirit of unbelief. The independence of respectability may harden into the insolence of defiance, and the sensitive cheek of modesty into the brazen face of shamelessness. It may be true that the habits of years are hard to change, but this is not true of the first 16 or 17 years of a young person's life. Else Kitty Hamilton and Joe could not so easily have become what they were. It had taken barely 5 years to accomplish an entire metamorphosis of their characters. In Joe's case, even a shorter time was needed. He was so ready to go down that it needed but a gentle push to start him, and once started, there was nothing within him to hold him back from the depths. For his will was as flabby as his conscience, and his pride, which stands to some men for conscience, had no definite aim or direction. Hattie Sterling had given him both his greatest impulse for evil and for good. She had at first given him his gentle push, but when she saw that his collapse would lose her a faithful and useful slave, she had sought to check his course. Her threat of the severance of their relations had held him up for a little time, and she began to believe that he was safe again. He went back to the work he had neglected, drank moderately, and acted in most things as a sound, sensible being. Then, all of a sudden, he went down again, and went down badly. She kept her promise and threw him over. Then he became a hanger-on at the clubs, a genteel loafer. He used to say in his sober moments that at the last he was one of the boys that sadness had spoken of. He did not work, and yet he lived and ate and was proud of his degradation. But he soon tired of being separated from Hattie and straightened up again. After some demur, she received him upon his former footing. It was only for a few months. He fell again. For almost 4 years this had happened intermittently. Finally he took a turn for the better that endured so long that Hattie Sterling again gave him her faith. Then the woman made her mistake. She warmed to him. She showed him that she was proud of him. He went forth at once to celebrate his victory. He did not return to her for 3 days. Then he was battered, unkempt, and thick of speech. She looked at him in silent contempt for a while, as he sat nursing his aching head. "Well, you're a beauty," she said finally, with cutting scorn. "You ought to be put under a glass case and placed on exhibition." He groaned, and his head sunk lower. A drunken man is always disarmed. His helplessness, instead of inspiring her with pity, inflamed her with an unfeeling anger that burst forth in a volume of taunts. "You're the thing I've given up all my chances for. You, a miserable drunken jay, without a jay's decency. No one had ever looked at you until I picked you up, and you've been strutting around ever since, showing off 'cause I was kind to you, and now this is the way you pay me back. Drunk half the time and half drunk the rest. Well, you know what I told you the last time you got loaded. I mean it too. You're not the only star in sight, see?" She laughed meanly and began to sing, "You'll have to find another baby now." For the first time he looked up, and his eyes were full of tears. Tears both of grief and intoxication. There was an expression of a whipped dog on his face. "Don't, Hattie, don't," he pleaded, stretching out his hands to her. Her eyes blazed back at him, but she sang on, insolently, tauntingly. The very inanity of the man disgusted her, and on a sudden impulse she sprang up and struck him full in the face with the flat of her hand. He was too weak to resist the blow, and, tumbling from the chair, fell limply to the floor, where he lay at her feet, alternately weeping aloud and quivering with drunken, hiccoughing sobs. "Get up," she cried. "Get up and get out of here. You shan't lay around my house." He had already begun to fall into a drunken sleep, but she took him, got him to his feet, and pushed him outside the door. "Now, go, you drunken dog, and never put your foot inside this house again." He stood outside, swaying dizzily upon his feet, and looking back with dazed eyes at the door. Then he muttered, "Put me out, will you? Put me out, damn you! Well, I kill you, see if I don't." And he half walked, half fell down the street. Sadness and Skaggsy were together at the club that night. 5 years had not changed the latter as to wealth or position or inclination, and he was still a frequent visitor at the Banner. He always came in alone now, for Maudie had gone the way of all the half-world, and reached depths to which Mr. Skaggs's job prevented him from following her. However, he mourned truly for his lost companion, and tonight he was in a particularly pensive mood. Someone was playing ragtime on the piano, and the dancers were wheeling in time to the music. Skaggsy looked at them regretfully as he sipped his liquor. It made him think of Maudie. He sighed and turned away. "I tell you, Sadness," he said impulsively, "dancing is the poetry of motion." "Yes," replied Sadness, "and dancing in ragtime is the dialect poetry." The reporter did not like this. It savored of flippancy, and he was about entering upon a discussion to prove that Sadness had no soul, when Joe, with bloodshot eyes and disheveled clothes, staggered in and reeled towards them. "Drunk again," said Sadness. "Really, it's a waste of time for Joe to sober up. Hello there," as the young man brought up against him. "Take a seat." He put him in a chair at the table. "Been lushin' a bit, eh?" "Give me some and drink." "Oh, a hair of the dog. Some men shave their dogs clean, and then have hydrophobia. Here, Jack." They drank, and then, as if the whiskey had done him good, Joe sat up in his chair. "Hayes thrown me down." "Lucky dog. You might have known it would have happened sooner or later. Better sooner than never." Skaggs smoked in silence and looked at Joe. "I'm going to kill her." "I wouldn't if I were you. Take old Sadness's advice and thank your stars that you're rid of her." "I'm going to kill her." He paused and looked at them drowsily. Then, bracing himself up again, he broke out suddenly. "Say, did I ever tell you about the old man? He never stole that money. No, he didn't." He threatened to fall asleep now, but the reporter was all alert. He scented a story. "By Jove!" he exclaimed. "Did you hear that? Bet the chap stole it himself, and's letting the old man suffer for it. Great story, ain't it? Come, wake up here. 3 more, Jack. What about your father? Father? Whose father? Oh, don't bother me. What? Here, tell us about your father and the money. If he didn't steal it, who did? Who did? That's it, who did? Old man didn't steal it. No, he didn't. Oh, let him alone, Skaggsy. He don't know what he's saying. Yes, he does. A drunken man tells the truth. In some cases, said Sadness. Oh, let me alone, man. I've been trying for years to get a big sensation for my paper, and if this story is one, I'm a made man. The drink seemed to revive the young man again, and by bits, Skaggsy was able to pick out of him the story of his father's arrest and conviction. At its close, he relapsed into stupidity, murmuring, "She throwed me down." Well, sneered Sadness, you see drunken men tell the truth, and you don't seem to get much guilt out of our young friend. You're disappointed, aren't you? I confess I am disappointed, but I've got an idea just the same. Oh, you have? Well, don't handle it carelessly, it might go off. And Sadness arose. The reporter sat thinking for a time, and then followed him, leaving Joe in a drunken sleep at the table. There he lay for more than 2 hours. When he finally awoke, he started up as if some determination had come to him in his sleep. A part of the helplessness of his intoxication had gone, but his first act was to call for more whiskey. This he gulped down, and followed with another and another. For a while he stood still, brooding silently, his red eyes blinking at the light. Then he turned abruptly and left the club. It was very late when he reached Hattie's door, but he opened it with his latchkey, as he had been used to do. He stopped to help himself to a glass of brandy, as he had so often done before. Then he went directly to her room. She was a light sleeper, and his step awakened her. "Who is it?" she cried in a fright. "It's me." His voice was steadier now, but grim. "What do you want? Didn't I tell you never to come here again? Get out or I'll have you taken out." She sprang up in bed, glaring angrily at him. His hands twitched nervously, as if her will were conquering him and he were uneasy, but he held her eyes with his own. "You put me out tonight," he said. "Yes, and I'm going to do it again. You're drunk." She started to rise, but he took a step towards her, and she paused. He looked as she had never seen him look before. His face was ashen, and his eyes like fire and blood. She quailed beneath the look. He took another step towards her. "You put me out tonight," he repeated, "like a dog." His step was steady, and his tone was clear, menacingly clear. She shrank back from him, back to the wall. Still his hands twitched, and his eye held her. Still he crept slowly toward her, his lips working and his hands moving convulsively. "Joe! Joe!" she said hoarsely. "What's the matter? Oh, don't look at me like that!" The gown had fallen away from her breast and showed the convulsive fluttering of her heart. He broke into a laugh, a dry, murderous laugh, and his hands sought each other while the fingers twitched over one another like coiling serpents. "You put me out, you, and you made me what I am." The realization of what he was, of his foulness and degradation, seemed just to have come to him fully. "You made me what I am, and then you sent me away. You let me come back, and now you put me out." She gazed at him fascinated. She tried to scream, and she could not. This was not Joe. This was not the boy that she had turned and twisted about her little finger. This was a terrible, terrible man, or a monster. He moved a step nearer her. His eyes fell to her throat. For an instant she lost their steady glare, and then she found her voice. The scream was checked as it began. His fingers had closed over her throat, just where the gown had left it temptingly bare. They gave it the caress of death. She struggled. They held her. Her eyes prayed to his, but his were the fire of hell. She fell back upon her pillow in silence. He had not uttered a word. He held her. Finally, he flung her from him like a rag and sunk into a chair. And there the officers found him when Hattie Sterling's disappearance had become a strange thing. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15. Dear, damned, delightful town. When Joe was taken, there was no spirit or feeling left in him. He moved mechanically, as if without sense or volition. The first impression he gave was that of a man overacting insanity. But this was soon removed by the very indifference with which he met everything concerned with his crime. From the very first he made no effort to exonerate or vindicate himself. He talked little, and only in a dry, stupefied way. He was as one whose soul is dead, and perhaps it was, for all the little soul of him had been wrapped up in the body of this one woman, and the stroke that took her life had killed him too. The men who examined him were irritated beyond measure. There was nothing for them to exercise their ingenuity upon. He left them nothing to search for. Their most damning questions he answered with an apathy that showed absolutely no interest in the matter. It was as if someone whom he did not care about had committed a crime, and he had been called to testify. The only thing which he noticed or seemed to have any affection for was a little pet dog which had been hers, and which they sometimes allowed to be with him after the life sentence had been passed upon him, and when he was awaiting removal. He would sit for hours with the little animal in his lap, caressing it dumbly. There was a mute sorrow in the eyes of both man and dog, and they seemed to take comfort in each other's presence. There was no need of any sign between them. They had both loved her, had they not? So they understood. Sadness saw him and came back to the Banner, torn and unnerved by the sight. "I saw him," he said with a shudder, "and it'll take more whiskey than Jack can give me in a year to wash the memory of him out of me. Why, man, it shocked me all through. It's a pity they didn't send him to the chair. It couldn't have done him much harm, and would have been a real mercy." And so Sadness and all the club, with a muttered "Poor devil," dismissed him. He was gone. Why should they worry? Only one more who had got into the whirlpool, enjoyed the sensation for a moment, and then swept dizzily down. There were indeed some who for an earnest hour sermonized about it and said, "Here is another example of the pernicious influence of the city on untrained Negroes. Oh, is there no way to keep these people from rushing away from the small villages and country districts to the south up to the cities, where they cannot battle with the terrible force of a strange and unusual environment? Is there no way to prove to them that woolen-shirted, brown-jeaned simplicity is infinitely better than broad-clothed degradation?" They wanted to preach to these people that good agriculture is better than bad art, and that it was better and nobler for them to sing to God across the southern fields than to dance for rowdies in the northern halls. They wanted to dare to say that the South has its faults, no one condones them, and its disadvantages, but that even what they suffered from these was better than what awaited them in the great alleys of New York. Down there the bodies were restrained, and they chafed, but here the soul would fester, and they would be content. This was but for an hour, for even while they exclaimed they knew that there was no way, and that the stream of young Negro life would continue to flow up from the South, dashing itself against the hard necessities of the city and breaking like waves against a rock, that until the gods grew tired of their cruel sport, there must still be sacrifices to false ideals and unreal ambitions. There was one heart, though, that neither dismissed Joe with gratuitous pity nor sermonized about him. The mother heart had only room for grief and pain. Already it had borne its share. It had known sorrow for a lost husband, tears at the neglect and brutality of a new companion, shame for a daughter's sake, and it had seemed already filled to overflowing. And yet the fates had put in this one other burden until it seemed it must burst with the weight of it. To Fanny Hamilton's mind, now all her boy's shortcomings became as naught. He was not her wayward, erring, criminal son. She only remembered that he was her son, and wept for him as such. She forgot his curses, while her memory went back to the sweetness of his baby prattle and soft words of his tender youth. Until the last she clung to him, holding him guiltless, and to her thought they took to prison not Joe Hamilton, a convicted criminal, but Joey, her boy, her firstborn, a martyr. The pretty Miss Kitty Hamilton was less deeply impressed. The arrest and subsequent conviction of her brother was quite a blow. She felt the shame of it keenly, and some of the grief. To her, coming as it did, just at the time when the company was being strengthened and she was more importantly featured than ever, it was decidedly inopportune, for no one could help connecting her name with the affair. For a long time she and her brother had scarcely been upon speaking terms. During Joe's frequent lapses from industry, he had been prone to touch his sister for the wherewithal to supply his various wants. When finally she grew tired and refused to be touched, he rebuked her for withholding that which, save for his help, she would never have been able to make. This went on until they were almost entirely estranged. He was wont to say that, now his sister was up in the world, she had got the big head, and she to retort that her brother wanted to use her for a soft thing. From the time that she went on stage, she had begun to live her own life, a life in which the chief aim was the possession of good clothes and the ability to attract the attention which she had learned to crave. The greatest sign of interest she showed in her brother's affair was at first to offer her mother money to secure a lawyer. But when Joe confessed all, she consoled herself with the reflection that perhaps it was for the best, and kept her money in her pocket with a sense of satisfaction. She was getting to be so very much more Joe's sister. She did not go to see her brother. She was afraid it might make her nervous while she was in the city, and she went on the road with her company before he was taken away. Miss Kitty Hamilton had to be very careful about her nerves and her health. She had had experiences, and her voice was not as good as it used to be, and her beauty had to be aided by cosmetics. So she went away from New York, and only read of all that happened when someone called her attention to it in the papers. Barry Hamilton, in his southern prison, knew nothing of all this, for no letters had passed between him and his family for more than 2 years. The very cruelty of destiny defeated itself in this, and was kind. End of chapter 15.